Okay, presentation 12. We're looking at shared presence in a series of resonances that make a harmonic. In our time, coming up very quickly, the most interesting step that our planet will take is to have a planetary park for the first time at the site centered on Jerusalem. And my white paper on this was entitled New Jerusalem Planetary Park. It's an important thing to reintroduce presence, which is a quality of conscious continuity, into the culture of tradition on the earth, on this world. The mythic horizon has time intenses. There is a present moment, there is a past, and there is a future. So that mythic language, myths, the whole mythos, is always a story that has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an end. And that three-part division of time centers in its cycle around a present moment. The difference between a time that is split into three, having a present moment as the center, expressed by Omar Khayyam and the Rubaiyat as the moving pen having written moves on. The difference between that and presence is monumental. Presence brings out the quality of the continuity of time unbroken. There is no present moment, because if one refines your ability to be exact through contemplation, through prayer, through yoga, you can classically, in many ways, refine your sense of the moment so that when the moment comes, it does not register. In moments of great sharing, in moments of making love, in moments of birth, in moments of spiritual elation, time does not occur by the moment. And it clearly registers in high Dharma yoga, in very refined contemplation, in what is called prayer without end. One can see that the moment is actually a zero, not a one. So that it is a Zen moment that has a shunyata, not a tathata. And because the zero, the void, the emptiness, is not only complete, but perfect, it engenders spontaneously, immediately, the next occurrence. But the next occurrence has a peculiar dimension to it. Instantly, spontaneously, it is transparent. One of the all-time great expressions and accounts of this was the great teacher, the introducer of Zen Buddhism to the West, D.T. Suzuki, Daisetsu Taitaro Suzuki. Daisetsu means in Japanese great humility. His original name was Taitaro Suzuki. And when you see the first books by him around 1900, it's Taitaro Suzuki. But D.T. Suzuki was invited to Chicago from Kyoto as a young man to go to the Open Press Publishing Company to translate the Tao Te Ching into English, because he was masterful at languages and masterful at the deep subtlety. But his Zen master, Soyen Shaku Roshi, said to him, yes, you can go and you can do this, but you cannot go because you cannot do this until you have had your satori, your moment of enlightenment. And in fact, because you have matured to this point already, he was about 20 years old. If you do not have your satori by the time you must board the ship for the United States, then you must commit harakiri. You cannot continue in this life with this opaqueness of not having had your satori, your moment of enlightenment. In Sanskrit, it's called the Bodhi Tree, which originally was the enlightenment instantaneously. Later on, it became the thought of enlightenment, and that was a watered-down version of it. The classic version of it in its highest levels in the Vajrachadika Sutra, the Diamond Cutter Sutra. And that, incidentally, is written in homage and in resonance to one of Philo of Alexandria's great writings on who is the heir of who inherits the truth. When the moment came that he didn't have it, D.T. Suzuki was about to get up from his zazen that he had lost everything because of all of his talent, and that the moment had come and had gone. He woke up. Not only had the moment not come and had not gone, because there was no past, there was no future expectation whatsoever, there was only the continuity. And so he got up and he went outside of the Zendo, and he reports, he wrote this account when he was almost 95. He said, I went out and all the trees were transparent. All the buildings were transparent. And I looked down and I was transparent too. It is the transparency of the symbols that allows for time to flow unbroken in its continuity, so that instead of being time as a line, time as a storyline, time as a horizon of the plane of the line of time, time is discerned to be a field of infinite consciousness. And because it is a field of infinite consciousness, it is a complementary to nature, which is a field. But as nature turns out to be a zero field, consciousness turns out to be an infinite field. And that an infinite field has possibilities of making a harmonic with a zero field. So that later on, in terms of the development of logical forms, one can substitute infinities for zeros, or zeros for infinities, and you will not disrupt the logical form of the structures. One of the most incredible applications of this is in quantum physics. There is no way that there is a causality between two electrons that are separated by maybe billions of light years, but they have an entanglement because they both emerge together paired, and their pairedness was paired by the antiparticles, the positron, and that was sealed by the holes of the electrons and the propensity of the positrons to match those holes with emergence. So that when you put that scenario together, it's called today entanglement. And one can use quantum entanglement, as we're now progressing, to make quantum computers. Not working on bits, but qubits. On 4 bits that have hidden within them a common denominator of zeroness in its absence and in its fullness at the same time. So that a shunyata is also a pleroma at the same time. So that when we talk about presence, we're talking about more dimensions than a space-time that has been chopped up into 3 kinds of time, and therefore the 3 dimensions of space are somehow given limitations within the ability for us to connote and to cognize, now transformable by something that is recognition, not cognition. Something that expands connotation into an annotated openness. That ability to take an annotated openness is the origin of taking a language which is mythic and making it transparent so that one now reads allegorically. One now is able to phrase metaphorically. One is able to take the creative language and show that a rhetoric can become now winged. These words are winged, as Homer says, and they become a poetic. That poiesis in Greek means creating in such a way that the language now becomes shareable in its magical dimensionality of person. That the individuality that gave form to the rhetorical structure now has become permeable to a field of meaning that is accessible by 2 or more into infinity. There are no limits on how many can share presence at all. Not even limited by all. And so when we talk about shared presence here in the 12th presentation, we're building the harmonic set of appreciation for how to hear and how to hear transparently, and how to read and write symbols, because the reading and writing of symbols by an alphabet changes the mythic pictorial, the mythic graphic, the mythic sign indications into symbols that are able to be transparent and have a continuity that is unbroken, so that when one holds a book, for instance, classically, one is able to look at shapes, reoccurring shapes, in this case of ink on paper, and to read them, and to be able to hear them. The title page reads, Zarathustra, Philo, the Achaemenids, and Israel, being a treatise upon the antiquity and influence of the Avesta, by Lawrence H. Mills, Chicago, the Open Court Publishing Company, 1906. The same company that published D.T. Suzuki's great translation of the Tao Te Ching that allowed Paul Karras, the director of the Open Court Publishing, then to make his English translation. If one looks at the way in which you can read and write with an alphabet, when you are in grade schools, they tell you to make pictures in the first, second grade. By the time you're in the third or fourth grade, you want to be read to because those stories are alive to you. And little third graders love to be read to. When they get to be sixth graders, they like to begin to write their stories. They don't just make their letters. They don't just make their little assignments. But they want to tell stories. And you can notice this if you've ever raised a child. They not only like to have stories read to them or told to them, at a certain poesis, they like to make up stories. Little boys will play with their toys, and they will be in those stories. Because I was always bronchial from birth, I hardly ever went to school. And like Marcel Proust, I did all my living in bed. And I would draw little characters and color them in, and then cut them out with scissors and then put them in cigar boxes. My father smoked cigars. And because I was like that for years, I had literally hundreds and hundreds of characters in a dozen cigar boxes, and I could make up incredible epics that went on for weeks, involving thousands, complete with bottle caps of root beer and Coke as the bad robots that weren't characters. The whole quality is that language becomes a metronome of the dimensions by which we are able to move from present, past, and future to presence, which carries with it all the time. Aldous Huxley's phrase was the breath of the eternal. That when one speaks, the high talk, as Yeats used to call it, our breath is of the eternal, and we are able to have a language, even an oral language, that prizes a sinuous complexity of continuity. It's constantly morphing and scintillating, and when it is done with a high art, it can be dazzling. The first time that alphabets had this capacity was about just before 1900 BC. And oddly enough, in our time today, Summer Solstice 2009, the two tuning forks of the introduction of an alphabet transparency into the consciousness of human beings for the very first time in a major way, so that it would never again not be there as a facility. We're between what is today Israel and what is today Iran. And the simplest way to understand it is that, as we've been talking, Zarathustra and Abraham are contemporaries. They're both born about 2000 BC. And both at the age of 75 underwent a major transformation that led to a historical kaleidoscopic dimension being brought into play for the first time. For Abraham, he was 75. He was given a profound vision. His father, Terah, had just died. And his profound vision was that God came to him as a friend. And Abraham, in the conversation, said, "Since I am blessed by your friendship, what gift will you give me to seal this?" And he was taken by the hand and taken outside and shown the stars. 1900 BC, there were many more stars visible than there are now. And he was told, "As many stars as you can count, so will be your heritage." This is the way that Moses wrote it in the 1300s. It's the way in which Philo commented on it in the early 1st century AD. But the transparency and the harmonic of the meaning is that it isn't the counting of the stars. It's that each of those stars is a world that is inheritable in this larger field that you now have come, further dimensions. And as you will be able to see more and more of these worlds, so too will your heritage expand. That tops the rainbow covenant of Noah by considerable. One of the qualities of a presencing that is shared is that one now becomes family together. That spirit families occur, and that instead of there being lines of inheritance, there is now a field of heritage which is complex. And that complex flow of the heritage within the infinite field of consciousness makes it possible to have an interchange at the center between symbols and vision, between mythic character and artistic person. So that what becomes increasingly evident is that the old ritual limitations, the limitations of existential form, no longer are limitations. They may be there, but they're there in this case. They're there in these conditions. They operate in these circumstances. If you change the circumstances, if you alter the conditions, if you jazz up the existential emergence, you will have a wider and wider array of ritual possibilities. So that ritual now, like symbols that became transparent, they become transformable. And so existence gets a tone of magicality to it. And one of the peculiar delights is that Mother Nature's zero field likes this. As Whitman once observed in Democratic Vistas in 1876 for the centenary of the United States, he said, nature seems to love two things about us most: freedom and variability. She likes all different kinds of people who are free to be whoever they will be. And that this makes it interesting. It makes life interesting. And one is not in a mythic cycle. One is freed to occur within the infinite varieties, and this then relates us to the cosmos. That we become friends with, not protagonists in, the cosmos, which has a recognition of not our individuality, but the transformation of our character into the art of our person. So that spirit persons are those who can inhabit the cosmos in its infinite presence. This is called eternal life. Consistently throughout all of the visions that our planet and its heritage have made available to us. Here is a translation in the Tao Te Ching. I took the T.T. Suzuki Chinese characters and the words that he used to translate those characters in 1898 and brought my own poetic into play so as to utilize the Chinese characters. I'd had 2 years of Chinese at San Francisco State, so I was familiar at least with many of the characters. The way the Tao Te Ching begins, every other word, every other character is Tao. Da-da, Tao, da, Tao, da, Tao, da, Tao. It is a syncopation of stating and returning immediately to the fullness of the context out of which that particular character came, that particular word came, that syllable came, so that one now gets used to immediately in the Tao Te Ching of breathing without huffing and puffing and speaking so that the language flows with the space of the breathing as a part of its articulate art of expression. Tao, causing, Tao, not eternal, Tao, name, causing name, isn't eternal name. Non-having is heaven, earth beginning. Name is the 10,000 things mother. Therefore, eternal non-having desires is a contemplation of mystery. Eternally having desires, in contemplation is given the boundaries. These two themselves, same origin, yet differentiate by the name. This same is called profundity. In profundity is profoundness, all mystery from this gate. Not only the gate of 0 and 1, but as one goes on in the Tao Te Ching, one comes to the complement to Tao, which is Te. And Te, the 38th chapter of the Tao Te Ching, reads this way in my poetic. Superior Te, not Te, therefore Te occurs. Inferior Te never loses Te, Therefore, no te occurs. Superior te is a resonance action and nothing, thereby causal acts. Inferior te acts as itself and has thereby a pretending action. Superior gen acts, but no pretending. Superior E acts integrally and has therein pretensions. Superior Li acts differentially, but when no one responds, stretches forth its arm and enforces itself. Thus, phasing Tao, there then occurs Te. Phasing Te, there occurs Gen. Phasing Gen, there is E. Phasing E, there is Li. Now, proprieties are loyalty and faith. Exaggerated, this is the beginning of disorder. Premature knowledge, as Tao, is projected unfolding, a beginning of ignorance. Therefore, great amplified man dwells in thusness, not abiding in externalities. He dwells in the fruit, not in the expecting of a flowering. Therefore, he avoids the other and chooses an other. So that the quality of a poetic is that one can write it transparently so that one can pull the character of a language that would have a protagonist quality in myth into a wonderland where now there is like a wizard possibility of new without end, worlds without end. The classic way in which this was expressed is that time, when seen from this field of conscious dimension by a higher dimension person, like a sixth dimension person, will look retrospectively back and see that the time forms were not lines at all, but that they were kept within cycles. That those lines were not straight, but that they curved in the sense that they were attracted by the belief. They were attracted by the expectation. They were attracted by the identification that there was a center, and thus the timelines circled around that present and created a past and created a future, but now one sees that it isn't that time forms are cycles, but that they have a continuation into an ecology of transforming consciousness. And out of this comes not circles with centers, but out of this comes infinity signs that have a point of no dimension as their contact. That locus of no dimension was first expressed by Pythagoras. That one can take a line and you can divide that line by the middle. Then you can divide those two parts by the middle. You will then have a 4-part fractioning of that line, which can be put together in various ways so that you can reassemble not only the unity in terms of 1/4 plus 1/4 plus 1/4 plus 1/4 equals 1, but you can move those proportions of 1/4 around, and you can set up then a new way to express unity as a harmonic. And out of this will come a way of creating a music that is not limited to a cycle, but is expressive in an ecology that has its breathing spaces carried within it. In a written language, in a printed symbolic language, the spaces between the letters allow each letter to have its quanta. The spaces between the words allow for the word. And the spacing all through up to including the page and the paper and so forth, all of this is a way of allowing for the visioning to move freely, so that when one reads something, this is on the cycle of the Phoenix from Tacitus, you can hear visionarily what he wrote 2,000 years ago. Next year, the consuls were Paulinus, Fabius, Persicus, and Lucius Vitellius. It was now at the conclusion of an age-long cycle that the Phoenix appeared in Egypt, a remarkable event which occasioned much discussion by Egyptian and Greek authorities. I will indicate the facts on which there is agreement and certain others which are doubtful but not wholly fantastic. The Phoenix is sacred to the sun. Those who have depicted it agree that its head and the markings of its plumage distinguish it from all other birds. Regarding the length of its life, accounts vary. The commonest view favors 500 years, but some estimate that it appears every 1,461 years, and that the one last scene flew to Heliopolis in the reign of Sesostris, Amasis, and Ptolemy III of the Macedonian dynasty. And he goes on and concludes, the details are disputed and embellished by myths, but that the bird sometimes appears in Egypt is unquestioned. That I can read this to you and you can hear this, that we understand what it is that we are communicating, is a sign that our dimensionality has jumped to a 7-dimensional historical kaleidoscope. Without that kaleidoscopic dimension, we would not be able to use language in this way, because the transparency of the symbols, if it were only visionary consciousness, it would be only an infinite field. It is the prism of the person that allows for the frequency of infinity to play itself out like a very special cosmic rainbow. We have computers that will give you several million colors now. And we're just beginning. Let's take a break. Let's come back. Part of our building up of the classic origins of shared presence resonance is that in nature, time has cycles, but in consciousness, time has forms which are able to be transformed. And it is the transformation of forms that is of the highest wisdom in terms of consciousness. Time forms that are transformed, once they are transformed, because there is no past that is indelibly having been, and there's no future that is indelibly fated, and no present that is a moment atomic-like that cannot be gone into. The classic power of the meditation of the historical Buddha was that he went into moments of thought, so-called present moments, and found that they have a 16-part array. 8 parts are discursive and occur as parts. The other 8 parts occur, in music it's called a trill. They're never discernible, but they're like an 8-part chord. In my education, there are 8 phases, but there are 8 intervals between each of the phases, and the intervals have no discrimination, whereas the phases have enough discrimination so that one can understand that one is moving through phases. Something solid has a different quality from something liquid, or something that's gaseous, or in the 4th phase, something as a plasma. We read earlier in the Tao Te Ching about the 5-phase energy cycle in Taoism. Tao, Te, Gen, I. I is the symbols, like in I Ching, symbols of the book of symbols. And the 5th classically was translated as Li. The best way to translate it is Qi or Qi, which can come back into the Tao. And if it comes back into the Tao, not having been interfered with, then the cycle flows without impedance. The first place that impedance occurs is with the middle, with Gen, human-heartedness. If we interfere with human-heartedness, it shows up that the next phase will be, Philo says that there are several ways that it can be distorted. One is that it can be crushed, one is that it can be mutilated, and one is that it's totally ignorant so that it doesn't know and doesn't understand that knowing can occur. The symbols are the first place that the injury to the mythic experience of our character, of our feelings, of our imaging occurs. And so to have a therapy, to have a therapeia, the Greek word is therapeia, one must found one's inquiry in the capacities to symbolize. And because symbols always bring the integral cycle to its completeness, what shows up is that the injury to one's character shows up with mutilated or crushed or missing symbols. And so the completion, instead of occurring as an energy cycle, which would continue the frequency, goes off into, the best word is a phantasmagoria. It goes off into fictiveness. It goes off into nightmarishness and doesn't go back to Tao, doesn't recycle. So that the therapeia in Chinese medicine is always to reinstate the qi so it's able to go back, which means then that one needs to retune the way in which the symbols have gone awry, but they have gone awry because of a fracturing of your experience, your language, your images, your feelings, but they are based on the rituals, on the existentials. So in Chinese acupuncture, one puts in the little needles to increase the flow of the qi so it's not impeded. And that in the natural cycle, it will flow along lines. There are no lines in the body, but the threadness is in the tissued fabric of our existentiality. And so it acts as if it were. And so the acupuncture will eventually reopen those channels. And when all of them are working together, the qi will be whole in that it can recycle back through the Tao and reemerge in a Te. And in that reemergence, there is never an impairment. The emergence of Te from Tao is unimpairable. If one reinstates then the basis of our feeling, the basis of our images, the basis of our experience, the basis of our language, by a Te which is able freely to move through our Zhen, our human-heartedness, then the symbols will naturally be available to have a transparency by a medium of interchange. Because the core of our experience being integrable by symbols is the use of languages that take the images and the feelings in the stream of experience and allow for them to be full-rounded, as it were, so that the cycle is complete, but has another quality that completeness did not furnish, and that other quality is perfection. The completeness can be perfected in the sense that it does not stop, does not just cycle indefinitely the same way, but refines. So that a transform of that symbolic capacity of the integral, the pivot of it is to have a refining fire. That's the way alchemy used to talk about it. A refining fire is one that is not intensely hot, not coolly low, not in some intermittent pattern, but the refining fire is continuous in the sense that it participates in the field of infinite vision. So that one of the great images of the alchemist laboratory, this would have been in Shakespeare's heyday in the 1590s, the beginning of the 1600s, in a huge volume, the amphitheater of wisdom chemical, the theater chemicum, amphitheatrical sapienti theatrum by Heinrich Kunrath. I'll put into the notes of our shared presence, which will be ready after next week's presentation. I'll put a copy of that in. One sees in the laboratory, here's the chemical apparatus for the chemical alchemy, but over here is a prayer tent, and it's very much like an ancient Semitic desert prayer tent with the striped tenting done with the desert dome shaping. And there the alchemist is going into a deep prayer, and that this complements each other in the sense that the laboratory itself then has a focus of a spirit accessing to the transform field, and the ability to have the instrumentation accept that dimension and apply it, so that then the natural occurrence is one where the magic is worked, magic from ancient Persia, the Magi, in that the transform has been applied and works. This quality shows up in the very nature of my proposal for the New Jerusalem Planetary Park. It's not just having a special city set aside like a Singapore or what Hong Kong used to be. A planetary park that features Jerusalem in a resonant, kaleidoscopic historical dimension that also has the differential conscious vision field as a dimension, and has prismatic persons that bring these two into play and create a new kind of a resonance with the cosmos. We talked last week about having the beginnings of it at Mount Nebo, which is currently in Jordan, from where Moses had his first and last view of the Promised Land, unable to go into it himself because of an infraction and a fracture to do with his refusal at one time to continue. But from Mount Nebo, where he is buried, all the way down the Wadi Karar, which is a tribute going into the Jordan about 2 miles from the Dead Sea, where John the Baptist used to baptize, where Elijah went up into the desert to be uplifted, where Jesus went after his baptism to spend 40 days alone in the desert in that region. It is a visionary treasure of the planet for thousands of years, that area. So that the Mount Nebo area and down the Wadi Karar across the Jordan, including Qumran's site, up the road to Jerusalem, including the major greater Jerusalem area and Bethlehem, and then a road as a part of it, like the road that goes down from Jerusalem to the Jordan and across to the Mount Nebo region. A road that goes from Jerusalem all the way to the Mediterranean coast. And that this site on the Mediterranean coast would be something like a 4 square mile, 2 mile by 2 mile seaport, so that world shipping would be able to contact the New Jerusalem Planetary Park. And that one of the major way stations in between would be in Hebron, at the site of Abraham's burial cave, the cave of Machpelah, that there would be like an Abraham Inn for an interchange at this point coming up from the coast, that the road from the coast would be a part of the New Jerusalem Planetary Park, and that this port on the Mediterranean could be called Port Isaac in honor of Abraham's son Isaac. But on the other end of it, as it goes to Mount Nebo, there would be another site that would be for his first son, Ishmael. And that this site for Ishmael would be the spaceport. So that one would move from the seaport, Port Isaac, to the spaceport, Ishmael. And in between would be the linking of Jerusalem, Bethlehem, all the way over to Hebron, down to the coast, and that road from Port Isaac to Hebron would be called the Isaac Way, and from Jerusalem to the spaceport would be called the Ishmael Way, and linking Bethlehem with Hebron, linking the birthplace of Jesus with the burial place of Abraham, would be called the Magi Way. This would bring the three great religions that prize Jerusalem together, intertwined in such a way that Islam, Christianity, and Judaism would share in the planetary park in such a way that the roads linking these sites together would be wide enough to not only have several lanes of traffic each way, but would have a median, and the medians all the way would be planted with trees like date palms, figs, olives, medicinal plants, would be a corridor of a park way, all the way from the coast to the Ishmael spaceport by Mount Nebo. And every so often, maybe every 5 or 7 or 10 miles, there would be way stations for petrol, for dining, for health, whatever travelers and wayfarers would require. And New Jerusalem Planetary Park would have such a huge tourist trade. Plus, it would be a center of world commerce because it would be